Jimosophy, interpreting events to build wealth. Hi, it's Jim at Jimosophy.com. Today we're going to look at the Canadian housing market, in particular how you get a mortgage, how the mortgage market works, and then we're going to look at the current situation today in Canada. So right here we have the house that this little guy here wants to buy. If he's prime, if he's got a good credit rating and a good income, he'll probably go to a bank, and the bank will look at his income and his credit score and appraise the value of the property and give him a mortgage. If he's not prime, if he has a poor credit rating, or he doesn't have an income history, keep in mind 20% of Canadians now are in the gig economy, they're self-employed, so they don't have that T4 slip from an employer to prove their income levels. So he would go to a non-bank, quite often a mortgage broker, who actually control 30%, originate 30% of mortgages today. In fact, banks originate less than half the mortgages in Canada today. Why would he go to the non-bank? Because again, his income is sketchy, a little lower, and his FICO score, his credit score, could be in the 600 range, right? The CMHC up here wants a 680 score. The CMHC is the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation. Now, it's a government crown corporation, so it is the government of Canada. There's two other insurers here, Genworth and Canada Guarantee. Now, those two are private, but the CMHC guarantees 90% of the loan to Genworth and Canada Guarantee. So what would happen is the non-bank or the mortgage broker is probably going to get the money for the mortgage and get the guarantee from Genworth or Canada Guarantee, which will guarantee a low credit score. And they'll avoid the CMHC, keeping in mind the CMHC guarantees Genworth and Canada Guarantee up to 90%. So you have these financial institutions here, near non-banks and banks, the shadow banking system, right? They originate the mortgage, and as soon as they originate your mortgage, they sell it. And if it's $1 million mortgage, they get paid $1 million cash. Once they get the $1 million cash, they're going to make more mortgages. So they sell it when they get it. It's possible they could hold it for the cash flows. The large banks do hold a lot of them, which could get them into trouble if real estate corrects, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, where does the cash come from to buy the mortgage? It comes from Canada Housing Trust prints Canada Mortgage Bonds. Canada Mortgage Bonds are CMBs, they call them, right? They're just a printed bond guaranteed by the government, so they print these up. And what happens is when you pay your mortgage, the interest payments on the mortgage are generally a little bit higher than the interest on the Canada Mortgage Bonds, so the government actually makes a small profit. So you can see that it's virtually government run except for the originators who quickly sell the mortgages, and they package the mortgages into a mortgage-backed security. So that would contain some mortgages that are poor and some that are really good. And the CMBs fund the MBSs. That's how it works in Canada. The CMBs can be sold to investors around the world, but currently in the crisis we're in with COVID, the Bank of Canada, which is the central bank of Canada, that's the banker's bank. It's also the government's bank. So the Bank of Canada has actually stepped in recently and bought $7.95 billion worth of CMBs. So the good thing about the Bank of Canada is they can print money, they say. It's not real, actual money. It's digital money. And they just make an entry in the central bank's balance sheet, which has increased substantially over the past since April from about 100 billion to 500 billion. So they're stepping in. That could ultimately result in a lower Canadian dollar. The more money they print, the less the money is worth. We'll see how that works out. So that's pretty much the system. Again, you want to buy a house, you're poor credit rating or poor income history, You're going to go to a mortgage broker and through the shadow banking lending system. You have a good credit history, you're going to go through the bank, right? These financial institutions here, keep in mind, they have every incentive to sell to you because, if you go through a mortgage broker, they basically take 1% of the entire mortgage. So if it's $1 million mortgage, the mortgage broker makes a $10,000 profit, the brokerage firm. So there's every incentive for them to lend to sometimes virtually anyone because they get the 1% and they're guaranteed payment if you don't pay. They're absolutely guaranteed payment through the CMHC and Genworth and Canada Guarantee. Also, they sell the mortgage right away and they get cash for it. So these institutions get cash to lend more and more mortgages and they're guaranteed and they make a big profit on lending. So you can see they have every incentive in the world to fuel the market to get everybody in a house. The rest of the system is just all government. In the United States it's a bit different. They had Fannie and Freddie up here and Ginnie Mae. They also had Wall Street involved in actually buying up the mortgages and paying cash, and then they would securitize them, create those CDOs that ultimately contained some of the subprime mortgages, and eventually it blew up when real estate started to fall because it's all based on this particular house price, the appraised value of that home. Okay, if we go down here, we can look at house prices in Canada. I picked the Greater Toronto area. We can see at the year 2000, we're up around $200,000-$300,000 for the price of a house, which has increased year after year after year to about 2017. It made a slight blip and then continued onward and upward towards over $1 million, 1.2 million. Now here's what this guy will do because he's human. He's probably got an income level of somewhere around $80,000 a year on average. Could be a bit higher, could be a bit lower. But so he's income poor, but he's real estate rich because his house keeps going up in value. So naturally what he does is he's going to borrow against the equity in his house. So as the house price rises, he's going to refinance his mortgage. Say his house is worth $500,000. He'll refinance his house at $600,000. So he'll owe $600 instead of say $500. The bank or the non-bank will give him $100,000 cash to spend on a swimming pool, renovations, a trip to Hawaii, or a Mercedes. Of course, at the same time, he'll probably take out a home equity line of credit, a HELOC. There's $300 billion worth of those floating around in Canada. And he can spend the money whenever he wants. It's basically a loan that's secured by your house, and you can spend the money as you wish. And then when it goes to $600,000, he takes out another $100,000 and buys another BMW, and it goes to $700,000. He might buy another investment property. It goes to $800,000. He refinances, increases the HELOC, and he's using his house as, they say, an ATM machine. No need to work. Over the past 20 years, if you're a homeowner, you're just going to get rich borrowing against it. Naturally, there's a $1.65 trillion worth of mortgages floating around there, and $300 billion plus of HELOCs floating around there, and Canadians are the most indebted people in the world. Can this continue? Well, it's gone on for a long time, but something happened called COVID, which is a black swan, an extremely rare event that nobody really could have foreseen that always has a great impact, kind of like 9/11. Things that you can't see have a major effect. COVID has resulted in 20% of people deferring their mortgage, simply not paying them. Now keep in mind, about 67% of people own and 33% of people rent. But so you have 20% of people not paying their mortgages, and my bet is it's probably the people that are less than prime or have lost their job. Speaking of losing your job, the only way you can pay your mortgage, if it's not, your house isn't rising in price, well, even still, you'd have to have a job. So we have 4.1 million people on CERB getting $500 a week now. It's $400 a week. Looks like that's going to continue for 28 weeks. And of course, the Bank of Canada is printing money like it's going out of style. You might call it quantitative easing, QE 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. And the balance sheet grows. Again, this will ultimately should negatively affect the Canadian dollar ultimately, because they can't really increase interest rates to even support that dollar fall, because if they increase interest rates, the house of cards will really collapse as people have higher and higher payments. The reason you haven't seen the dollar decrease lately is because the US dollar, the world's reserve currency, which all currencies and all commodities are measured in, is falling faster. So as the US dollar falls, the Canadian dollar will rise. So don't be fooled by a rise in the Canadian dollar. You should always just look to the US dollar and you'll see they're in a similar situation. Obviously much bigger, it's a much bigger country. But Americans are nowhere near in debt as Canadians. Canadians are the most in debt in the world. So the situation's a little more dire here, and you can see that it's all based on the government. In fact, that's what makes the Canadian system perceived as solid. So really, the threat could be systemic. It could be a threat to the government of Canada, which would not be good. It depends on the perception that other countries have of our country, if it's credible, and that might be what it comes down to, whether we're deemed as credible or not. Of course, there's always the possibility that the U.S. would bail us out, which they actually did during the U.S. subprime. If you check back, there was a tremendous amount of borrowing going on from the Bank of Canada from the U.S., and they were nice enough to lend lots of money. People didn't even think the subprime existed here, but some of the Canadian banks were in a big mess in 2007, 2008. So COVID's really the game changer. When the deleveraging begins, and I don't see how it cannot, that's when everything sort of works in reverse. So I guess the takeaway, if you look at Jimosophy.com, there's an article, Reasons to Invest in the United States. They're less in debt than we are, the consumers, right? And their system isn't nearly out of whack as it is here. Here you have, 11 times household income. You make $80,000 here, your house is worth $1 million. Or $880,000. In the United States, it's not nearly in that kind of shape in virtually any market in the U.S. So they're less indebted. Plus, they're the world's reserve currency, and they're probably the only country in the world that can print money and sell marketable investments that they can market around the world. Canada might not be as lucky. So prepare yourself for this. Be sure to visit Jimosophy.com. Thanks for listening. Jimosophy, interpreting events to build wealth.